Coming to terms with the 21st century city, and perhaps what separates it the farthest from its predecessors in time, would be the advent of computer science. The applications of the discipline have intertwined with our everyday lives, so much so that it's now almost a life skill to navigate through the nitty gritties of computers and the corners of their connections across the world. From an individual's social and economic activities down to the very fundamental proofs of their identity, somehow, fortunately or unfortunately, can be traced down to this marvel of technology, which still, at large, remains a black box for the common public. We are in conversation today with an expert in this fascinatingly vast field of computer sciences, Professor Debayan Gupta, whose primary research interests include secure computation, cryptography, and privacy. Professor Gupta completed his Bachelor's of Science in Computer Science from St. Xavier's College, Calcutta, following which he went on to the Yale University and completed his PhD in Computer Science as well. He has held an extraordinary faculty position at MIT and currently is an assistant professor at the Ashoka University, while also being a visiting professor and research associate at MIT. In this scintillating conversation with Professor Gupta, we scratch the surface of the endless world and applications that the discipline of computer science spills into, while also exploring in discussions the intriguing ideas and the marvel that brings him to his current research inclinations, his engagements with the new world ideas, while being interested in a plethora of complex topics outside of it as well, as he delves into very candidly in the conversation with us. Joining us as hosts today in this conversation are KVNG Vikram, currently a scientist at the Space Applications Center, and Sahil Mittal, who's currently working at the Plaksha University, and I am Naman Jain. This is Zeroing In Season 4.
So right away diving into the question of privacy that you cover a lot. How comfortable are you with this conversation being recorded right now?
So I'm going to throw you into the deep end right at the beginning. Okay. That's because this is something that a lot of people, I won't say don't get wrong. It's more about the assumption that one knows the definition of something while only having a vague, hazy idea about it, right? There are different kinds of information out there. There is information that is secret that I don't want to give out to anybody ever. There is information that is private. There is also information that is sensitive. Okay. And we mix these three up all the time. And especially as cryptographers do a lot of that as well. We mix up privacy and secrecy a lot. Now, in this case, I'm talking to all of you. So I already know this conversation isn't secret. There are some corporate types who might call it confidential, but that's hard to define properly. Now, in this particular case, knowing that we're going to be doing this recording, and I'm not going to be putting out any sensitive information out in it already, I'm perfectly fine having it recorded. The issue would be, however, let's say if you were my medical doctor and you were recording it, I might still be okay with it being recorded, but I might have a lot of worry about the purpose limitation of it. Who is this person going to forward it to?
Thank you for that. So basically our first question is that we see there's a lot of fad about computer science in India because of the money and the prestige it has attached to it. But since your profile is very much mixed, doesn't just stick to computer science, it has a lot of social justice, law, philosophy, and all attached to it. What made you go into this direction from the beginning?
So I'll give you two answers to that question. One, it was definitely not my plan. I started out doing artificial intelligence stuff, specifically robotics. I was working on robots to help autistic children manage their behavior and so on and so forth. It would teach kids to have eye contact and so all of that stuff. And I got into cryptography entirely by accident. But I really liked the subject because it was one place where the math made sense to me. In a lot of cases, I like pure math, but sometimes, it's like you're doing something just for the heck of it. Or you're doing something because some other people in your field think it's important. And cryptography, and there are certain other areas which one calls applied math, where you do the math and it feels like you're actually achieving something. Going back to the question that you asked, there's this fad around computer science. If you'll allow my usage of Hindi, it's because paisa milta hai, right? That's the main reason. Everybody thinks I'll add some programming, computer science, something, something. And there is a very big difference between programming and computer science. It is exactly the difference between being a mechanic and being an automotive engineer. Both of those jobs are important, but they are different. But there is, I think, a deeper reason beyond that. There is the superficial reason that, oh, there's money in it, IT is a big industry, yada, yada, yada. Even though, as you all know, most of the people who end up working in IT are mainly using Excel and maybe SQL. So it's not clear to me why one would need a college degree to do that. Unlike many college professors, I'm strongly against college. I don't think most people need to go to college. But coming back to this, if you remove that superficial layer, that, okay, computer science, there's money in it, it's a wildly expanding field, therefore people want to do computer science. The deeper reason, I think, is because computer science is math on wheels doing things. There is a certain beauty to it, and, take what I say with a grain of salt, because I'm obviously the selection bias. You picked a person who chose computer science, right? But I think it represents a particular way of thinking about the world. So, why is computer science so successful? We say that, oh, people want to get into computer science because computer science gives you greater salary, it's monetizable, it makes you successful, yada, yada, yada. But why is that? To me, I think the real reason is that computer science, it's a fairly modern subject. And it has hit upon this idea of the study of processes. I think that's what it is at its core. Mathematics, in some senses, is the study of the imperative. You provide a truth, you look at other truths, and you derive more truths. That's a very bad definition, but we'll let it be there for now. If you say y is equal to x squared, you can start thinking about, oh, if something is squared, then the output is probably positive. And if I tell you this is 5, that is 25, you can start plugging in values and you can start thinking about it. Computer science doesn't go into that. Computer science says, okay, given a number, y, how do I find x? What is the process? Why is it hard? Is it always harder to find a cube root than a square root? If so, why? It's not clear to me that it is. Maybe there's a trick, like, you get multiples of 3, you add the digits up. Maybe there's a trick to it and we're just too stupid to notice. And because literally everything you do is a process, in some sense, computer science is the monetizable, process-focused version of mathematics. And because mathematics is everywhere, computer science is everywhere. Everything is a process. And you know that phrase, the journey is more important than the destination? To me, understanding destinations, that's mathematics. And the study of the journey, that's computer science. And you can apply that idea to almost anything. And that's why I think it's become so important. So there's a certain group of people who are attracted to computer science to make money. And those are mainly the programmer types. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? That's a very important part of the job. But for me and many, many, many other people, the reason I like computer science is that it allows me to look at problems in a very, very, very different way.
Coming to this part where you said that it's fun for you to do maths and all, but this is not the way it is being taught in India in a lot of colleges. So, do you think it is the failure of the Indian education system not to inculcate that feeling for computer science in itself, or just the society in general that this is a money grab, so you have to go in that field?
So I think there's some feedback there, right? If society didn't look at it a certain way, the subset of society that is the education system wouldn't look at it in that same way. The answer to your question is an unmitigated and absolute yes. The Indian education system completely, there's the odd exception, but it completely fails its students in terms especially of mathematics, computer science, and frankly, most other subjects. You mug something in time for your exam, you get your grades and you get out. Even if one is studying English, right? It's one of my favorite, English and history are two of my favorite subjects. I'm a huge World War II buff. Basic mathematics, things like, I don't know, probability theory or something, right? Or complex numbers. They are taught in such a bad way. Probability theory, the extent of people's probability theory knowledge appears to be There's a numerator that counts certain events. There's a denominator that counts another set of events. Let's put one over the other and hope to God it doesn't go outside 0 to 1. That is not a valid way of thinking about probability. There are so many different approaches. And so, if I try to teach quantum computing and suddenly I write down probability and then I'm writing a complex number, they're like, no, all this is not making sense. And it's because we become so afraid of these things.
Yeah, since you mentioned privacy and neural networks, I wonder hypothetically, I train a neural network for a real world application with training data that has private info. Is there any possibility that this network will break privacy even when no private data is given as input while using it?
First of all, your fear is absolutely accurate. Neural networks can unintentionally memorize some of the values. And this is very, very, very common. You can actually reconstruct parts of the input in many, many cases. All right. And there's an entire field of study looking at sort of preserving privacy in these systems. For example, by adding noise to these networks or doing other things. There's all sorts of clever stuff that people have come up with. But it is a very legitimate question to ask. And this is especially important because many people, because of quote unquote privacy reasons and laws such as GDPR, are moving to something called federated learning. Federated learning, very simply put, is a case of, if the mountain does not come to Muhammad, Muhammad must go to the mountain, that sort of thing. So what you do is normally in a neural network, any kind of box that does stuff with information, what do? You feed the information into the box does something and it spouts out an output, right? The problem with that is you need that information to put in the box, and maybe you don't have the right to hold that information in the first place. So what people sometimes do is do this thing called federated learning, which does the following. Instead of asking people for information so you can put it in the box, I send you the box. You put your information into it and you give it back to me. It's not quite that simple. It's sort of, I make a lot of copies of the boxes. Everyone puts their own information into it, trains their own neural network, send it back to me, and I literally average everything. And it works out fairly well in many, many cases. But especially in those scenarios, if the network is sort of memorizing certain inputs and so on, it's a problem. And that's without even getting into the issues around fairness and accountability and all of that stuff.
And for a user, it's like a black box with no way to see what is being memorized.
Correct. And this is especially dangerous for people who don't fit in. Let me explain why. Whenever you have outliers in information, that can be very revealing even in the barest of statistics. Let me give you a concrete example. Let's say you're publishing the average salaries of people. I like dealing with salaries because people think it's important information. Now, suppose you're doing average salary of everyone in a room, you publish that information. And you're thinking, I'm just publishing average, what's the problem? Bill Gates walks into the room. Now, I have a 100% accurate way of knowing that Bill Gates walked into that room. You understand what I'm saying? If not Bill Gates, one of a very small number of people. Because your statistics, when affected by an outlier, your statistics are going to twitch in particular ways. And this is a huge problem. And it turns out this idea of anonymity is just very, very hard to get. If you're taking data and you're saying you're stripping away personal information in some way and still being able to use it, doesn't really work. In fact, there are very strong theoretical results that show it mostly just won't work at all. The last few times people tried to say things like this, that, hey, I am somehow using some arcane mechanism or the other, I'm going to make sure that your private information, your secret information, your sensitive information remains with you, and somehow I'm going to compute it, learn some interesting details from it. It's been broken very, very quickly and very, very easily. Like, it has not worked out well for the people who sent out those challenges. And that's one of the main reasons why things like, say, the National Digital Health Mission and so on, many people are working very hard to make sure that things remain private, because it's very difficult to deal with medical data and things like that. There was a professor, I think, Arvind Narayanan and Vitaly Shmatakov. They did this amazing de-anonymization attack on Netflix. so Netflix used to put out these challenges for something called link prediction. Imagine a bunch of blue dots, those are all people. A bunch of red dots, those are all movies. And obviously, you've watched certain movies. So you draw lines between blue dots and red dots to indicate that these people have watched those movies. And now what you can do is you can try and predict what is the next movie you are likely to watch. So it's a recommendation algorithm. And it's really important to entities such as Netflix to figure out what kinds of movies people are likely to watch next. And what they used to do was anonymize all the data and send out challenges. So these gentlemen got together and they were like, you know what? Instead of trying to solve the problem we're meant to solve, we'll just de-anonymize everything. And it turns out that after, let's say, removing certain blockbuster movies, the next 6 or 7 movies you watch is essentially a perfect fingerprint. I know who you are just by looking at the next 6 movies that you watched. And this is true of all sorts of things. There was, I think the governor of Massachusetts said, hey, this medical information is completely anonymized, and someone de-anonymized his information the next day and sent it to him. Right? Like, it just doesn't work. This idea of stripping out IDs, somehow protecting your data, or, having your data in some kind of black box, somehow protecting it, is very, very difficult to achieve outside of very controlled circumstances.
But yet these technologies are being used in like public spheres a lot. Like Hannah Fry in her book mentions this one case with the Walmart, with their coupon system that they targeted specifically pregnant women and gave them the coupon. But they did not know that the identity of that pregnant woman wasn't out to her family. And it became a big case. The father tried to sue Walmart for it. So how do you even approve stuff like this to work in the first place? Because you know that it's not going to be properly anonymized.
So there are 3 or 4 things there. First, does the government have the right or the mandate to regulate this? There's a public policy question there, right? There's a governance question there. If I, as an individual, have the ability just by looking out into the world to derive certain information about the world, can the government prevent me from deriving such information? Then comes the question of having derived that information, do I have certain restrictions on how I can publish that information? Is that a problem? Should the government have the right to prevent me from doing so? But obviously, we feel the other way when I sort of stretch it to the other extreme of, let's say, Amazon or Walmart or whoever else gathering data about me and being able to profile me very, very accurately. And there we strongly feel, no, we need to be protected in some way. Exactly where that line is to be drawn is not a very easy thing to think about. Personally, for me, I think regulation very rarely is a sign of leadership. Usually regulation occurs after the people want it. And right now, I'm very much afraid that at least in India, people don't really care very much about privacy. It's like, I'm not angry that the NSA or the FBI or RAW saw my post. I'm angry they didn't hit like.
Talking about our data being collected by larger bodies and stored in a centralized database, I get that a big organization doesn't care about the memes I share. I'm just a puny individual. But what if someone in my locality who has some enmity with me and has the access to this database? The implications of many people having access to this information are scary. Is it possible to prevent such things by design?
Yes, there are a lot of solutions out there. The first part of your statement where you said, personally, I feel like I have not much to hide. I have little to hide. I always encourage people to finish that sentence, right? You have nothing to hide from whom? And very soon, once you start thinking about the people whom you could have stuff to hide from, a lot of stuff comes out. Okay? And it's not just government employees. It's all of these companies and governments, frankly, who keep data that's sort of easily accessible by all sorts of random people. I remember a year or 2 ago, Domino's lost a huge amount of their data. And this hacker was just putting it up on the internet for free. And I looked it up and my phone number and home address and all of this stuff was there. So imagine if you are a person who's stalking somebody, right? You're a stalker, you're looking for information on this person that you've been following around. you can't find his or her home address. You know their phone number, but you haven't quite been able to find their home address. This is a treasure trove. Governments in general have a lot of information. There's no standards, right? The way Chennai will keep your data is different from the way Delhi will keep your data. And the levels of security are accordingly mixed up. And so one of the worst things about especially this kind of data is you can't take it back. You can't change your date of birth. You can't change your fingerprints. You can't, it's not stuff that you can say that, oh, that one got out, I'm going to change to something else. And so that can lead to a lot of problems. Unfortunately, there is very little that we as individuals, beyond really going off the grid and being super paranoid, can do about it. There needs to be extremely strong regulation. And people understand it. That's why, the Indian government has been trying to work on this personal data protection bill. So that one got scrapped, but there's a new iteration of it coming forward. But these things are very, very, very difficult to understand.
Yes, and it's even harder for older people to understand these. And these are the people who make our laws and policies. Since it will take the laws some time to catch up, should the developers who invent new tech be taking any precautions and do things in any different way?
So laws often take time to catch up. I think as a society, especially with things like sensitive information, there's a lag. It's like you're playing a game and there's lag in it. There is a gap between what is possible to do and what society believes is evidence. For example, if tomorrow you saw a photograph, a clear, distinct, high-quality photograph of Modi and Xi Jinping, and you saw a photograph of Modi taking a syringe and injecting something into Xi Jinping's neck. Completely ridiculous, right? But suppose you saw a very clear photograph of this. Now, suppose I showed you that photograph in the 1940s. Depending upon the quality of the photo, you may well believe that there is no way this could be, you would believe it. But today you see this and if you be like, no, this is complete nonsense. Why? Because, Photoshop is a thing and it exists. And it has the idea that photos can be morphed or edited has sufficiently permeated our societal psyche that we don't immediately jump to the belief that this is true. There is a lag between what technology can achieve and what level of awareness we are at of that level of achievement as a society. Even though we may technically know it, it's not the same. And it's the same with privacy. If you're driving on the street, sometimes you'll see these cameras on red lights. Well, any color lights, really. We call them traffic cameras. Now, the thing is, when you're driving around, these traffic cameras, you're in public, right? You have no expectation of privacy. So in the vast majority of countries, this traffic camera data is not a problem. It's okay for police to access it. Technically speaking, this traffic camera data is a replacement for a police person standing next to that crossing, let's say, and writing down your car number if, let's say, you go through a red light. And let us assume that this camera does exactly what it's supposed to do and doesn't have any other extra behavior. It can't turn around and look at something else, for example. It does exactly what it's supposed to do. Look only at the street and look only at cars. The problem is that once you scale this problem, you gain the ability to do a completely different set of things. So there are two questions. Question number one, is it okay for a police person to write down your number as you go down the street? Most of us will say, yes, that's okay. So a technical replacement for the same, it feels okay to us as a society. But what if I ask you, is it okay for the police to put a GPS tracker in your car and track you 24/7? Most of us, hopefully, would say, no, that's not okay. They need a warrant for that, at least. Except it turns out, because of quote-unquote technology, you give permission for the first one, which is traffic cameras. It gives them the power to do the second one. Because what I can now do is, because I have 1 lakh traffic cameras in the city and they're all networked together, I can find out exactly where you went at any given time. There's dedicated software that does this. So it's not like some police person sort of scrolling through photos trying to find your car. This is automatic. And the moment you provide this ability to do this quote unquote otherwise unauthorized thing using grandfathered in authorized means, what that automatically results in is a complete lack of oversight. Because with warrants, you had some oversight built in because you knew this was a sensitive object. But now they can get to that sensitive object without passing through those layers of oversight. And there's a lot of that happening. You gave them permission to track ABCD without realizing, and it's frankly impossible to realize in many cases, that it would give them the ability to track and find out EFGH about you. So really, privacy is inadequate in this context. You can't possibly keep everything about you secret. And all sorts of inane things like your movie choices or a picture of your kitchen. By the way, a picture of your kitchen likely can reveal all sorts of crazy things about you, because I can probably guess your religion, I can guess your income level, I can guess all sorts of things just from a photo of your kitchen. For a government to expect the average person to be able to understand and deal with all of that is ridiculous. That doesn't work. So we're not just looking for privacy, we're looking for some kind of purpose limitation in law. Because how much information are you going to hide?
Coming back to the law that you were talking about, the Indian's data policy, which has been scrapped for now, but it had a very good point in it about right to forgotten, that they were going to add to right to privacy also. But since you talked about that multiple countries don't have same law system, so how would it be implemented as such? Because technically all of this data is not Indian data.
It's very, very, very hard. So first of all, there are 2 points to be made there. First, right to be forgotten doesn't mean your name is scrubbed from the internet. It's more about a particular set of results which are removed. So suppose someone spread a rumor that Debayan is a murderer. I sue this person for defamation and they're forced to redact their complaint, but I'm like, wait, in the interim, 10,000 people wrote articles believing that Debayan is a murderer. So now anytime anyone searches for Debayan's name, it's like murderer, 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 murderer. And I'm worried I'll never get a job if that happens. So instead of asking those websites to take down content one by one, there might be a blanket way to do it. It is not clear to me how well or how easily that might work, especially since, as you said, the internet is a global place. And because there is global communication, the problem is even thornier than you suggested. So, for example, what if an Austrian person living in New Zealand sends an email to a Japanese person living in India? You know, which countries should get access to that and who should store? Like, it's very hard. I think it is, as you suggest, things like right to be forgotten are not easy things to do. I think the scrapping and the extra time they're taking with the data protection bill is very, very, very important. And the reason behind that is what happened prior to this is people were getting into this game thinking, okay, this is an unregulated sphere. I'm going to put in certain common sense regulations and everything's going to work out. And that is not the case. I think the only comparison to the global information network, it is frankly the only planetary scale achievement that humanity has, other than perhaps global warming. The only thing comparable is the international monetary system. And I think you need to get into making laws about privacy and security and these sorts of things with the same level of preparation and, readiness as if you're proposing a new international tax law. That's the level of complexity, and it's worse because it's all faster and there's layers in there. And we know we've basically been abject failures at international tax regulation. There's tax havens everywhere. It doesn't quite work out. So what makes us think that, regulating the international information network, which is so much faster, so much more complicated, and has so many more players than the international monetary network, is going to be so easy? I think it's going to be unbelievably, insanely hard, and we're going to fail a lot, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. But we should get into this game, as I said before, with a lot of preparation.
Yeah, for the listeners, sarcasm intended. What is the upcoming surveillance technology you are most excited about?
I don't know if I'd use the word excited, but I think we're already very good at facial recognition. And that is going to spread rapidly. We've heard rumors of China already doing it to some extent, but I think companies and governments are not going to be able to resist. What if you didn't have to carry a Metro card? You could just walk through and it would auto identify your face and auto debit from your account. And you get an SMS the moment you pass through a metro station. There's a lot of people who might want that. Maybe it's an extra layer of verification. So I think facial recognition is going to spread very, very quickly, and it's probably not a good thing. But I don't know. It depends on what kinds of safeguards there are. I don't want to have a knee-jerk reaction to it. But that's definitely one kind of surveillance that's going to happen incredibly fast. All right. The second kind of surveillance that I'm kind of worried about is financial surveillance by, insurance companies and banks. Now, in many countries, and since I mentioned China, I'll reuse it as an example. I think it was Tencent Investments, I can't remember. They were caught looking through people's trash to see what kinds of toothpaste and toothbrushes people were using to gauge their income levels. How often do you replace your toothbrush? If you're not, then maybe you're getting poorer. It sounds like nightmares, but it's like, wait, it's a great way to do stuff. If I go neighborhood by neighborhood looking at trash, and if I can reverse engineer the average level of affluence in that neighborhood, that's probably pretty useful information. And again, it is hard to frame laws that say, wait, a bank can't own a trash company and cross-send data across. So I think there's going to be a lot of secondary profiling of that level, which may not be individual level profiling, but it may be something close to it. I also see an incredible increase in the level of cyber attacks done by governments, and that is just not okay. And that is a huge problem. I think taxpayers need to push their governments and say, no, you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to spend our money building these systems, which absolutely inevitably come back to bite us. Governments love mass-scale surveillance. Certain high-up people in one of these three-letter agencies in the US were called upon, and they were asked, why are you collecting all this data? Paraphrasing, but only slightly, he redefined the English word collection in order to defend his agency. He said, no. It's not collection when we get the data and store it. It's only collection when we look at the data. I'm like, I didn't realize libraries were not collections of books until I read them. Very interesting. But that's what they're following. They're saying, I'm going to record every phone call, let's say, or 80%. And that's not a problem because nobody's looking at it. It's only when we look at it, when we access that later, then it's collection. There's a lot of this level of nonsense going on in the world. And I'm quite afraid that it's only increasing because it's getting cheaper to do bulk surveillance because computers are getting faster, storage is getting cheaper, etc., etc.
Coming to a little bit on the economic aspect of this, if you take the Metro card example, it may be very good for stopping certain illegal activities, but all of this kind of affects mostly the working class, because this kind of surveillance system may not possibly affect people with power and money, even though it is illegal for them. Don't you think this will further disparity among the rich and the poor?
I mean, there's enough disparities between the rich and poor already. Income inequality is only increasing. The particular example you gave me, I'm not sure I find it super convincing in that sense. I agree with you, it'll happen, but I think there are bigger problems when it comes to income inequality. And I think one of the worst things about this kind of setup, I use UPI a lot, for example, is great, right? But it's not cash. It's not anonymous. What happens tomorrow if everything is centralized and controlled and there is a person who is bad in the eyes of the government? And UPI is the main way to do transactions. Most places don't even accept cash, right? What if I just delete his or her UPI account? There are reasons why systems such as cash have evolved. Just because something is efficient doesn't always mean it's a good idea. We learned that during COVID. all of these companies had made their supply chains so efficient and had removed all the redundancies, you snip one thing and suddenly everything falls apart. All the supply chains fell apart because certain lines of supply chains weren't working, and you didn't have enough redundancies because you had snipped away all the redundancies. You'd said efficiency is king. Money is a system which we've understood over a long time. And one of the most powerful elements in a democracy is the idea that people who are not liked by those in power can still operate on the ground. And yes, that leads to a certain amount of criminality. But we tolerate that. If the government said, hey, let's allow police to search everyone's homes without a warrant, great, that would definitely catch you more criminals, but we don't want that. The government doesn't get to do that. And this is regardless of which country you are in. It's a bad idea to give a government that kind of power because they too are corruptible. So that balance needs to be maintained, and the anonymity of travel, the anonymity of money and things like that is absolutely critical. In our country, for example, during the years of emergency, our current Prime Minister Modi, he did a lot of stuff where, he was moving around and not traceable, shall we say. But nowadays, let's say you implement new systems where all train systems, you just swipe your Aadhaar card and it'll do something. And it's much more efficient, right? Because you have one card for everything and you won't lose it. And let's say it is perfectly secure. We completely secure it. There is no evil person who can hack into this network. So we give you perfect security and you have one card or your face. Let's say it's not even a card. And you can go anywhere and it's automatically, if you're above a certain age, you get the proper fare, you get a deduction. If you're a student, you get a deduction. Everything's done automatically. There is no corruption because you don't need to pay off any intermediate agents. So you've reduced corruption and you've, made it easy. It's massively efficient. But now you couldn't have anonymous travel anymore. In the next emergency, Prime Minister Modi couldn't have traveled around in secret in this new world that I'm proposing. So efficiency and the government having the ability to do everything is not necessarily the best way to go. What you want is, and I personally am a big believer in small government, and that's a political opinion, not a technical one. But I do think we need to be very careful about what powers are given, because it is a question of trust, and that should be minimized as far as possible.
Talking about trust and control, let's see between having a centralized or a decentralized database. Maybe with finance, should it be decentralized?
Decentralized or hard to track / anonymous, these are very, very different things. There are plenty of cryptocurrencies that claim to be decentralized, but you look at the mining power owned by, you take the top 10 CEOs, they shake hands, it's all over. Decentralized doesn't guarantee anything. Decentralized and owned by people who operate independently and have different incentives, yada, yada, yada. There's a lot of other masala you need to add on top of this before it's edible. In fact, in many applications, it is not necessary to make something decentralized in order to make it trustworthy. For the vast majority of cases, it is actually better not to collect the information in the first place. With a lot of information, the first question one should ask is, why do you even need said information? Right? I go to CCD to buy a cup of coffee, they're like, phone number. In many places, I can't blame the employee. They can't produce the bill without you giving out that detail. Right? Yeah. And again, this becomes very difficult to solve legally. I think we're becoming too Americanized in many senses, where we're like, oh, we have a problem. It needs to be solved either technically or legally instead of socially. Because if you look at the legality of it, you say, okay, let's make a law. People are not allowed to ask for phone numbers. Is that really going to work? Pantaloons is going to say, okay, we're increasing our prices by 5 rupees. And anyone who signs up with us by providing your phone number, we'll give you a 5 rupee discount. Now you'll say, oh, you can't sign up for customer loyalty programs? Like the workarounds are laughably simple, right? It's not going to work out. You can't, legislation and technical trickery is not the solution to everything. One major way to enact change, and in fact, with most of human history, the major way to enact change has not just been laws, it's about what society deems to be acceptable. I assure you, fashion is far more powerful than most legal norms. So we make it so that people will say that, hey, I'm not going to give it to you. I don't want to give it to you. And if enough people push back, companies will naturally stop asking for this stuff. And yes, there needs to be some regulation in support of that. But I think, again, going back to this thing I said before, I think regulation very rarely leads. Most of the time, it follows something that is already a social push.
Yeah, true. Now, going towards the academic side of things, we tried to go through some of your papers. We did not understand anything. So, just going by the titles here, maybe a few abstracts. One of the titles is a compiler or interpreter for secure computation. I thought it depends on the person who writes the code. If you are a good programmer, does the compiler matter?
I love suggesting papers, and since I suggested one of Arvind's papers, his advisor also has a very nice paper called The Most Dangerous Code in the World. It's one of my favorite papers. Go look it up. Okay? And I won't get into what the topic of the paper is, but it in certain ways supports the statements I'm about to make. In most companies, getting the darn thing to work is the main thing you want. Adding security is always adding security on top. It's this extra layer on top. Does that make sense? Yeah. And that can be dangerous for obvious reasons. Now, if you code at all, you know it's easier to mess stuff up in certain languages than others, right? If you're coding in C, for example, which doesn't provide you that much protection, you can very easily mess stuff up, right? You can access array indices that are not supposed to be accessed by you. You might mess up memory locations and get seg faults, right? Yeah. Whereas certain other languages will protect you against doing that. They will say, hold on, you can't access array index this. That doesn't work. You're not supposed to be here, right? Yeah. And even before your program executes or attempts to execute, these languages will stop you from doing those bad things. Does that make sense? So that is with, why would a compiler make your code more secure in any way? So there's loads of things you can do to prevent a programmer. So you add some rules to the compiler to prevent a programmer from performing certain kinds of bad actions. Does that make sense? So that's half the reason. The other half of the reason is there are a lot of complicated security protocols which you cannot expect the average programmer to deal with. And these things are not quite as easy as, quote unquote, using a library. Some things you can do just by using a library, right? If I'm doing FFT, I'll import an FFT library, I'll send it into this FFT function, and it'll give me something. Easy enough. But in these cases, it's more about which variables are allowed to be visible to an attacker who lives in your RAM. And whether if then else statements reveal something about what values you're using. So for example, if I say if x equals 0, do ABCD, and if x equals 1, do ABCDEFGH. So now all I have to do is I count the number of instructions that you execute, and I know whether x equals 0 or 1. There's a lot of stuff like that needs to be done at the compiler level. So in this particular case, though, we went a little bit further than that. What we were doing was implementing something called garbled circuits. So when you wrote a single program, we actually provided two programs that would allow two completely different people to jointly compute a function without revealing their inputs. Easy way to think about it is, let's say you have your salary, I have my salary. We want to know who has more, but without revealing anything. And we want one output, 0 or 1. Did you win or did I win? And nothing else. And this would provide us a way of doing that. That doesn't sound very impressive. It sounds like I could do some clever math and achieve it. Except it turns out we can do this for arbitrary functions. Which means Suppose you want to get from point A to point B, and I'm Google Maps, and you don't want to reveal what points A and B are, and I'm not willing to give you all my traffic data because you could sell it, right? And this theory, these sets of work suggest, and in fact we can do it, you can learn the path going from A to B without revealing A and B to me, which is like completely counterintuitive. How can I tell you how to go from A to B if you won't tell me where A and B are, right? It sounds incredibly stupid. Except, think about it, you have input x1, I have input x0, and together we're computing y. And y might only be revealed to you and not to me, for example. And this fits in that paradigm. We can do this for an arbitrary function. So this enables a lot of very counterintuitive things. But still, you have to be careful. Because let's say this thing, instead of publishing 0, 1, it published the average of our salaries. If I know my own salary and I know the average of our two salaries, I can just calculate your salary, right? So no matter how secure the protocol is, what you are doing also matters.
In general, I mean, over a broader picture, since we've been talking about the socioeconomic ideas and so on for quite some time, how does the field, for instance, sort of address this academically? Like, how do these two spheres fit? Because they have to fit together if you're talking about privacy and surveillance and so on. So how does the academic landscape basically look like overall? Because from the outside, it seems quite tricky.
We've mainly been failing at it very badly, and it's a huge problem. So there's a lot of fields where we do work that has socioeconomic repercussions or projections. And generally speaking, computer scientists have failed at it. The people who do AI have started to become a little bit more aware because they suddenly figure, hold on, people are using this to decide whether criminals or people who are accused of being criminals should be given bail or not. The Compass system in New York and so on. That seems like a terrible idea. We need to wait. People are using this to decide whether people should be given loans and mortgages or not. It's like the more people know about machine learning, the more they worry about this sort of thing. It's the same with crypto and with security and privacy in general. We've built these technologies, and the more we build it, the more we're getting concerned, but we haven't really gotten into solving these issues yet. The people in the ML front are a little bit ahead of us in that line of thought, but frankly, not by much. You know, even in India, I can tell you right now, banks deciding where to give loans. There are very large groups that decide this based on prior data that use machine learning. And this is a huge problem, this idea of sort of data and machine learning as a fair god. It's absolutely terrible. Let's say there's a particular area, traditionally disadvantaged, mainly Muslim. And for various historical reasons, not very many people have received loans in that area. And because the people who live there are disadvantaged, the percentage of people who, after taking a loan, fail to pay it back may be slightly higher. There are systems that will say, okay, the data says that giving loans out in this area is a bad idea because prior data suggests that I'm unlikely to get it back, and ML algorithms will flag this area, don't give loans here. So if you happen to live in a home in that area and you apply for a loan, you'll get rejected. And because it's happening in this black box, you don't get to blame a person. You know, if my boss refuses to give loans to Muslims, I know that he or she is a bad person. And I'll be like, you're really biased against this particular group of people, aren't you? But if a black box, which is quote unquote data driven and, you know, computational and does data science, and if that thing tells me that every time I give it a name that ends with Gupta, it says, do not give this person a loan, right? And doubtless there are many other such pitfalls that we are creating in our effort to create so-called secure systems. One of the worst is building efficient and secure systems that lock out the most marginalized communities. And people are aware of this. Let's say I mentioned UPI, and I was listening to, there was this IIT Bombay Trust Lab inauguration that happened a few days ago, and some of the people who built UPI were there, and they were talking about, we could have built a much more secure system, but we decided not to. Because we realized if we went too gung-ho on the security, we would lose out on enabling the financial inclusion of many marginalized people. Now, whether they succeeded at that or not, I'm not going to judge. We don't have enough data to judge that properly. It's a good thing they were thinking about these things. Because we technical people, there's a huge danger that we optimize for things, efficiency, security, privilege. We're just optimizing without stepping out and realizing, this is going to be used to affect real lives belonging to real human beings. That's not the objective of the system.
As soon as you mentioned existence, my mind jumped to Heidegger and all, because I had a similar question regarding that. But I'll come back to that later, since we are talking about maths. There was a paper on prime numbers, which was very, very interesting to read about, because there was a parity system and all. How do you even arrive? Like, for example, you can check something when you know that this is going to happen, but this is something you wouldn't know that is going to happen, right? So how do you arrive at that pattern itself? Because I love finding patterns in math myself, but this one was something you cannot naturally go.
How do you find out if a wall is soft? You gotta bang your head against a lot of walls. Research, by definition, is stepping into the dark combined with the ability to accept numerous failures. There are safe paths. The things that I talked about, hot research that you can do. There's a couple of things that I'm doing right now where I'm like, I know it will work. I'll do ABCD, something will happen, I'll write it up, I'll publish it, I'll get a few citations, it will just work out. And I hate those papers. Like, I'm doing it, but there's no excitement. Because it's so predictable. Right? It's like watching a movie, and in the first 5 minutes, that guy is wearing white, that guy is wearing black, I know who the hero is, I know who the villain is, it's all over. Right? Where's the enjoyment? But the moment you say there is excitement, when is there suspense? When is there excitement? Genuinely, when stuff can go wrong. That, to me, that's what real research is all about. Doing something knowing that everything could fall apart, everything could fail. But you need to have the guts to say, wait, I will step into the dark. Everything could fail. I can handle that. But if it doesn't, man, am I going to end up with something amazing. And I'm lucky that the institution that I am at currently allows me to do that. That's a very hard freedom to give for an institution compared to the guarantee of a certain number of papers published per year. So, for example, the Simons Foundation does this as well, massively, at a massively larger scale, but they do this sort of thing. So instead of saying, give me output, this many patents, this much dollar value, etc., I say, here's a hard question. Try and solve it for 5 years. Chances are you won't manage, but try anyway. And if India doesn't do this, guess what? All the big papers are still going to come out of Israel and the US and other countries. We're going to be stuck doing quote unquote innovations while the seminal stuff is going to come out of somewhere else because they were brave enough to work on problems that hadn't been solved for 100 years, right? So what makes you think you can solve it? The answer is chances are 1,000 people worked on it and failed. But you were the one who was like, there's no such thing as clever. Okay, everyone is clever. But you were the one lucky enough to have that spark on that particular day. If that bravery is not facilitated by the system, right? If it is not aided by the system, you get low quality, bad research, which is unfortunately much of what happens in this country. And again, we have amazing researchers, okay? No, I genuinely believe that we have such amazing, amazing people. And we know this because the moment they go to the US or something, they start doing amazing stuff, right? So what were they doing? It's because and you can't blame the government for this. It is the way society looks at it. It's this love of metrics. We say, oh, the government has reduced license Raj, but we haven't. We still love our metrics. We still want dollar value output. If we are not willing to push into core research, which is about knowledge building, capacity building, and sort of exploring the unknown, I'm sorry, we're going to be running second string behind the US forever. It's not going to work out that easily.
That makes sense. So we are kind of nearing the end right now. So we would like to engage you in a rapid fire round.
I will try my best to be rapid.
Alright. Should we accept cookies?
Yes.
Is it possible to have internet live without accepting them?
Yes.
Alright. How often do you use Siri, Alexa, or Google Assistant?
Never.
Should we use them?
No.
Do you use two-factor authorization?
I use multi-factor authorization. Yes. Authentication.
What is the weakest password that you can share with us?
Can I give a slightly longer answer to that question?
Sure, definitely.
So, going back to the very first question you asked about accepting cookies, the way I work with passwords and cookies and privacy in general, I have a very harsh demarcation. So, there are some things that are important to me, my bank accounts, my primary Gmail account, and so on and so forth. Those have extremely strong passwords, right? Which I memorize perfectly. I don't tend to write them down, but I have nothing against people writing it down and storing it somewhere secure. And I am very, very careful with that small subset of passwords. And when I use those websites, I have a separate browser for it. I realize I could use Firefox containers. I mainly use Firefox. Then there is everything else, and I just use a password manager for that. Because I don't even remember those passwords. I don't care about those passwords. And if I'm using random nonsensical websites, sometimes I just won't care. I will reuse passwords in those cases and I don't care. And I think that's the way we deal with other kinds of hygiene also. I think cyber hygiene is very much like hygiene in real life in healthcare. You need to build up a certain amount of background knowledge on what to do. Like if you get cut by a rusty nail, all of you know you should go take a tetanus shot. That's background knowledge. You don't need to be taught that. You learned that just by growing up almost. But when it comes to cyber issues, the equivalent of getting cut by a rusty muddy nail, let's say you've revealed your main banking password to someone or something bad happened. Your bank account got drained, blah, 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 blah. Do you know what to do? Do you know who to call? Where to complain? How do you get that money back? What are the first things you should do? Most of us have no idea. Forget us, big companies have no idea, right? Do you need to hire outside counsel? They don't know. Again, social background knowledge is just completely messing around this. And I try to apply the same kind of cyber hygiene to myself. So there's some things, eyes and stuff like that I need to keep extra safe. I'm not going to rub my face in the mud. But if I'm stepping in the mud, I don't care. I'll wash my feet later. It's sort of like that.
How often do you click on agree in the terms and conditions?
One has to do that all the time, right? These things have, again, no legal value. Just none whatsoever. I am the kind of horrible person that will occasionally read said terms and conditions. And I've seen more than one case of boilerplate content where someone clearly find and replaced everything. And sometimes you can tell, because suppose there's a company called AVA, and there's a word that happens to contain AVA and they've replaced it. It's like, class 12 student level plagiarism.
Do you think the encryption that we talk about, this WhatsApp encryption, chats and all, and we see it many places, is it safe?
They're mostly doing what they claim to be doing. It is end-to-end secure. Safe is a very strong word to use. It depends on, you hand your cell phone to your friend. That's not safe if it's open. But they are doing what they claim to be doing for the most part, which means if you send a message using most of these services, since you mentioned WhatsApp, I know them quite well, they're not lying about that. What people don't usually realize is there's also a WhatsApp business client. There's the WhatsApp client, there's also WhatsApp business. And the thing with WhatsApp business is a completely different story. So if I send a message to you talking about mattresses, Meta learns nothing. They don't learn that I'm talking about mattresses. In certain scenarios, they may learn that a message was sent, but that's pretty much about it. Other than some background logging, they don't learn anything. It's all peer-to-peer anyway. But if there's a company and I WhatsApp that company about mattresses, there's a bedding store and I ask about mattresses, it is not clear to me how actively they do this or whether this is sort of in use or not, but they do sort of quote unquote reserve the right to use that data. So if it's a WhatsApp business account, a different set of rules apply.
When you're signing up for a new website, do you think about the consequences of giving your mobile number?
I usually avoid giving my mobile number.
But sometimes there's no look around it. So what do you do then? Like,
Sims are cheap, dude. I have like 9 phone numbers.
I'll come to the last question. It's gonna be a mixture of philosophy and in general, since you talked about language of universe being existence and all. So this is the idea that comes from 1960s, Sartre and Heidegger and all. Since we talk a lot about freedom on internet now, that there's a lot of oppression that is coming. So do you think that ideas are gonna come back again since they went out of fashion a few years back? And second part to this question is, how do you draw a line between being a conspiracy theorist and being actually right about something? Since you talk about this WhatsApp reading our data, for general public, they don't have the means to find out the truth about it yet.
Let me answer that second question. And after I finish, if you could repeat the first, because I'll have forgotten by then. Short answer is you can't. I mean, history tells us this. Dude comes along, says, hey, maybe surgeons should wash their hands and tools after operating or before operating on someone. I'm like, what are you talking about? What nonsense? Diseases are caused by imbalances in black bile and yellow bile and so on. What does washing your hands have to do with it? Dude was ridiculed, died penniless, etc., etc., etc. And the story has repeated itself, right? The Galileo story, so to speak. So the idea that we're going to be able to consistently separate conspiracy theorists from well-intentioned people who are providing good arguments, it's hard. There are certain rules of thumb one can follow, though. The first is, it is incredibly hard to keep secrets the larger they get. So if anyone's implying there's a huge secret out there, they're probably wrong. Second, one can examine incentives. And third, it's always a good idea to be suspicious of governments. I wish I could say otherwise, but there are plenty of governments, Indian, US, all sorts of other governments, who've done all sorts of absolutely inane, crazy things with apparently no benefit. My favorite sort of example of that is the bulk surveillance performed by the United States. I encourage everyone to look up a particular ProPublica article talking about what's the evidence that bulk surveillance works. Just read that article, go look into stuff. I won't repeat it. Just go look into it. You'll spend a lot of time either laughing or crying or both.
To repeat the first question, basically it was like you mentioned that we have to live in a sense of skepticism all the time, which is in general causes a lot of anxiety. And that was the situation that happened in 1950s also. And that's why the movement of existentialism took up really well at that time. So do you think a lot of philosophers have been arguing that this movement will come back again? Because at this point, it's about freedom and fighting back.
I wish I could agree with you. I don't think that's going to happen. I think the way information has connected us all has meant that there are, we talk about identity politics a lot. One of the reasons this has flourished is because connectivity has made it possible to form groups with incredibly small subpopulations. So there's a lot of factionalism. So maybe, let's say, suppose I happen to be a person who has, let's say, non-standard gender identity of some sort. I identify as type B, whatever that means. Maybe there's not a lot of other people of type B around me. But I can join an internet community of 10,000, and 10,000 in the whole world is a vanishingly small percentage, and I can feel at home. That is a really important thing that the internet does. Guess what? So can a neo-Nazi. And because of this, it also means that people who form factions around very weird things can all form their own small groups. So I think having very large-scale, persistent, long-term protesting power is very difficult. Unless you're willing to go out in person. Unless you're willing to physically go out, it is very difficult. And people tend to not physically go out unless it affects two things. Either it affects their money or it affects their physical freedom. Unless it affects these two things, people do not tend to go out and protest.
This was a conversation from the 4th season of Zeroing In, the Science Podcast, where we're exploring the foundations of how cities were found, formed, and developed over the centuries to the shapes that they are in today. We extend our warmest gratitude to Professor Debayan Gupta for this fascinating discussion and for so candidly diving into the most abstract of ideas headlong, lending us beautiful insights of the real world, learning, and the joy of understanding through it all. On behalf of the seasoned team of Zeroing In, and I am Naman Jain. Thanks a lot for listening to this episode. We'll be back with a new episode next week with further interesting questions and conversations with eminent Indian scientists and researchers from across the world. If you have any suggestions, you can visit us on zeroingin.org or write to us on zeroinginpodcast@gmail.com and follow us on our Instagram or Facebook handles @zeroinginpodcast for the latest updates. Until the next time.